The hum was the first thing you noticed in the municipal records annex, and the last thing you forgot. It wasn't loud, just a persistent, low-grade thrum from the climate control systems that kept 3 acres of paper and microfilm from turning to dust. Elias Thorne felt it more than he heard it, a vibration that seemed to have settled permanently in his bones. For 8 years, it had been the soundtrack to his life, a steady, inanimate companion that asked for nothing. He slid another box of property deeds from the high-density shelving. The metal groaned softly in protest. D-Block, 1950 to 1959. The request was routine, a title search for a downtown law firm. Elias worked with a controlled, unhurried precision. He logged the box number, the date, his own initials. His handwriting was small and neat, each letter a defense against chaos. He'd learned early that control was found in the small things. The precise fold of a map, the correct categorization of a file, the quiet click of a door locking behind you. Control was a perimeter you built around a space you could no longer defend. His own house offered no such control. It was his great-uncle's, inherited 3 years ago along with a stack of final notices and a pervasive scent of decay. Martin Thorne had been a cartographer for the state, a man who believed the world could be understood if drawn to the correct scale. He had died alone in the house, and it felt as if the building were slowly following him into ruin. Elias lived in it because he had no choice, patching the roof when it rained, coaxing the ancient furnace back to life each autumn. The work was a form of penance, though for what, he was never quite sure. It was a physical task that quieted the other, noisier thoughts. The ones that had no solution, no file number, no clear point of origin. The ones that always circled back to his brother, Ben. Tonight, the job was the west-facing wall in the small study, where a patch of plaster had bubbled and cracked from a winter of ice dams. He laid a canvas drop cloth over the worn floorboards, the fabric smelling of dust and linseed oil. The light from a single clamp lamp cast long, distorted shadows, turning the familiar room into a landscape of uneven terrain. He tapped the wall with the handle of his scraper, listening for the change in tone that marked the studs. Solid, solid, hollow. The hollow sound was too wide, too resonant. He tapped again. It wasn't the space between studs. It was a void. He pressed his palm against the plaster. It gave slightly, a soft crunching sound like walking on old snow. He inserted the edge of the scraper into a hairline crack and levered it. A section of plaster and lathe, about 2 feet square, came away with a dusty sigh, exposing the dark, empty space of the wall cavity. And something else. Near the floor, nestled between 2 vertical joists, was a dark rectangle that didn't belong. It was a metal box, the size of a shoebox, its surface coated in a fine layer of grime. It wasn't rusted. It looked like stainless steel or aluminum. Elias knelt, the pressure in his knees a distant, familiar ache. He reached into the wall, his fingers brushing against rough-sawn wood and the surprisingly smooth, cold surface of the box. He withdrew it. It was heavier than it looked. There was a simple, sturdy-looking lock on the front, but no keyhole. A combination lock with 4 number dials set flush with the metal. He ran his thumb over them. The numbers were worn but legible. He tried his own birth date. Nothing. Ben's. Nothing. His great-uncle's. The lock remained shut. For a moment he considered putting it back. The house held enough secrets. He had no desire to unearth more. His life was built on the careful management of existing information, not the discovery of new variables. Discovery was disruptive. It led to questions, and questions, he had learned, rarely led to satisfying answers. They only led to more questions, a branching, recursive path into darkness. He remembered the blank, professional face of the police officer explaining Ben's accident. A patch of black ice, a loss of control. A simple, closed explanation. But Elias had driven that road 100 times. He knew where the ice formed. Ben had known, too. He set the box on the drop cloth. The single lamp glinted off its clean, unadorned surface. It was an object out of place, an anomaly in the slow, managed decay of the house. On the bottom, almost invisible under the grime, for digits were faintly scratched into the metal. 1-9-6-1. The year Martin Thorne had moved into this house. Elias paused, his hand hovering over the dials. It was too simple. Couldn't be. He turned the first dial to 1, the second to 9. The tumblers felt stiff and used. The third to 6, the fourth to 1. He pulled on the latch. There was a soft, metallic click. The sound was unervingly loud in the quiet room. He had not been denied access. He lifted the lid. The interior was lined with gray, felt-like material. There was no treasure, no stack of currency, no faded love letters. There was only a single manila folder, a small brass skeleton key, and a black and white photograph. He picked up the photo. 7 men in dark suits and thin ties stood squinting in bright sunlight. Behind them rose the massive, concrete face of a dam. His great-uncle Martin was one of them, younger, thinner, his expression unreadable. On the back, in faint pencil, were 7 last names. One of them was Thorne. He set the picture aside and opened the folder. It contained about 20 pages of what looked like technical data. Columns of numbers, chemical formulas he didn't recognize, and a series of hand-drawn maps. The maps were the most arresting. They weren't the clean, precise work he knew from his great-uncle's public archive. The lines were hurried, the lettering stark. They depicted a river valley, the same one from the photograph, he guessed. Certain parcels of land along the riverbank were shaded in, each marked with a date and a reference code. The final page was a typed list of those same codes, and next to each, a single word, acquired. He closed the folder. The air in the room felt thin, used up. This was not a family keepsake. It was a record, a deliberate act of preservation. His great-uncle, the quiet cartographer, had hidden a piece of his work inside a wall. Elias looked from the sterile metal box to the crumbling plaster of the house. One was meant to last. The other was meant to fail. He felt a familiar pressure build behind his eyes, the dull ache of a problem with no clear edges. He checked the date on his watch. It was after midnight. He carefully placed the items back in the box, closed the lid, and spun the dials. He did not put the box back in the wall. He slid it under the drop cloth out of the light. He swept the plaster dust into a pan, his movements slow and methodical. The hole in the wall remained, a dark, waiting mouth. The next morning, the hum of the annex felt different. It was no longer a neutral presence. It seemed to have a frequency, a resonance that matched the unease vibrating inside him. He sat at his terminal, the public search interface glowing with its placid, blue and white city crest. The request from the law firm was finished. The box returned to its shelf, the log updated. His own request was not official. It was a deviation. He typed Project 168 into the internal archive search first. 0 results found. He widened the search to all state-level databases he could access. 0 results. He tried variations. P168. Operation 168, nothing. It was a ghost. A project that left no official trace was not a project that had been forgotten. It was one that had been erased. He switched to the land records database, pulling up the digitized plat maps from the 1950s. Using his memory of his uncle's hurried drawings, he located the river valley. It was in Coulter County, a sparsely populated area about 60 miles north of the city. He began cross-referencing the parcels his uncle had shaded. According to the public record, dozens of farms and private lots along that stretch of the river had been sold to the state between 1959 and 1962. Most were categorized under eminent domain for the construction of the North Ridge Dam and Reservoir. It was a public works project celebrated at the time, a triumph of modern engineering. He pulled the file for one of the parcels at random. Miller, John and Sarah, a 100-acre farm, acquired June 1961. The transaction record was clean, unremarkable. The state had paid what was considered a fair market value. He pulled another, a small, 5-acre residential lot. Greaves, Walter, acquired July 1961. Another clean record, On the surface, everything was in order. This was the system working as intended, documented, filed, and preserved. This was the history the annex was built to hold. But his uncle hadn't hidden a file full of clean property records. He had hidden chemical formulas and shaded maps. Elias looked back at the photograph he'd brought with him, tucked inside his coat pocket. 7 men standing before the monument to progress. He scanned the names on the back again. Jansen, Crow, Miller, Thorne, Davis, Finch, Albright. He recognized the name Miller from the land file he'd just viewed. John Miller had sold his farm to the state in June 1961. But in the photograph, he was standing with the men who were part of the project, not one of the displaced. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Contradiction. A detail that didn't fit the official narrative. He switched to the personnel database, a separate system with more restricted access. He had legitimate clearance, but it logged every search. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was the line. Crossing it meant creating a record of his own curiosity. A small, digital breadcrumb that would lead directly back to his terminal, his name. The hum of the building seemed to grow louder. He thought of the box, cold and silent under the drop cloth at home. He thought of his brother's car at the bottom of the ravine. He typed in the first name, Jansen, Robert. The file appeared. Jansen, Robert. Hired 1955, State Water Commission. Senior engineer. Resigned 1963. No reason listed. He tried the next name. Crow Samuel. State Geological Survey. Geologist. 1952 to 1962. Deceased, 1962. Cause of death, industrial accident. He kept typing, his movements becoming faster, more automatic. Finch Allen, Department of Agriculture. Soil scientist. Resigned, 1963. Albright Michael, State Water Commission. Chemist. Terminated, 1964. The record was appended with a note. Subject to internal review. Do not release. Each entry was a small, sterile piece of a story. A cluster of resignations and a death, all centered around the 2 years the dam was completed and the reservoir filled. These weren't just employees. They were the technical experts. The geologist, the engineer, the chemist, the soil scientist, and the cartographer, his great-uncle Martin. He finally typed in his own family name. Thorne, Martin. State Cartographer's Office. 1948 to 1975. The file was longer. Martin had stayed. He hadn't resigned or been fired. He had worked for another 12 years after the others were gone. He had stayed inside the system that the others had fled. A quiet man who drew maps and kept his head down. A man who built a secret compartment in his wall. Elias logged out of the personnel database. The screen returned to the placid city crest. He had a list of names, a set of dates, and a collection of contradictions. He had followed the first thread, and it had led him not to an answer, but to a locked room. The key to that room, he suspected, was not in the municipal annex. The dam was a state project, but its scale suggested federal oversight, federal funding. That meant the deeper records, the ones that might explain the chemical formulas and the reason for the secrecy, would be held elsewhere. In the federal archives downtown. A place with stricter rules and a gatekeeper he knew by reputation. A woman named Evelyn Thorne. No relation, but the shared name had always felt like a small, strange irony. She was known for her efficiency, her encyclopedic knowledge of the collection, and her intolerance for fishing expeditions. To get a file from Evelyn Thorne, you needed more than a hunch. You needed a reason. He now had several. He folded the piece of paper with the names on it and put it in his pocket next to the photograph. He had started a record of his own. The Federal Records Center was a monument to institutional permanence. A gray cube of concrete and darkened glass, it seemed to absorb the city's sound, leaving a pocket of profound silence in its shadow. Inside, the air was cold and still, scrubbed clean of the city's grit. The low hum here was different from the one at the annex. It was a deeper, more confident tone, the sound of power at rest. Fluorescent lights cast a flat, sterile glare on the polished linoleum floors. Elias presented his municipal ID to the guard. He was a known entity here, occasionally retrieving shared jurisdictional documents. But today felt different. He felt like an imposter, his purpose concealed beneath a thin layer of professional legitimacy. He logged his visit and proceeded to the main research room. It was a cavernous space, mostly empty. A few graduate students were hunched over microfilm readers, their faces illuminated by the green glow of the screens. At the head of the room, behind a long, imposing oak desk, sat Evelyn Thorne. She was a woman who seemed to have been carved from the same hard, unyielding material as the building itself. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes, magnified by thick-lensed glasses, missed nothing. She looked up as he approached, her expression a careful blank. "Elias," she said. It wasn't a question or a greeting, simply a statement of fact. Her voice was low and thin, like paper tearing. "Evelyn," he replied, keeping his own voice even. "I have a retrieval request." He passed her the form. He had filled it out carefully, referencing a series of public works funding bills from the late 1950s. His stated purpose was a historical review of municipal-state infrastructure partnerships. It was plausible. Vague but plausible. The files he actually wanted were buried within the request. Geological survey reports and raw water quality data for the Coulter River Valley, 1958 to 1964. She took the form without looking at him, her eyes scanning the document. Her stillness was unnerving. She wasn't just reading the words. She seemed to be analyzing the spaces between them. She tapped a long, manicured finger on one of the line items. "The Coulter Valley data," she said. "The raw survey analytics. That's unusual. Most researchers are satisfied with the published summary reports. The summaries are incomplete for my purposes," Elias said. "I need to review the base measurements." "For a review of infrastructure partnerships?" She finally looked up at him, her gaze direct and unblinking. It wasn't an accusation, but it was a query that demanded a better answer. "You're a records manager, Elias, not a hydrologist." "My great-uncle worked on that project," he said, deciding a partial truth was safer than a weak lie. "Martin Thorne. He was a cartographer. I'm retracing some of his work for a personal project." The mention of the name caused a flicker in her composure, a brief, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. She knew the name. He was sure of it. She looked back down at the form, her expression once again unreadable. "The files are in deep storage," she said after a long pause. "It will take some time. Come back tomorrow." It was a dismissal. Elias nodded. "Thank you." He turned and walked away, feeling her eyes on his back. He had passed the first test, but he had also announced himself. He had placed his name next to Martin Thorne's in the mind of the one person who controlled access to the truth. The next day he returned. Evelyn was not at the main desk. A younger assistant handed him a single, slim document box with a nod. Elias took it to a secluded corral. The box was light. Too light. He opened it. Inside was a file, but it contained only the published summary reports he had specifically said he didn't want, and a single sheet of paper on top. It was a memo dated 1965, stating that the raw geological and chemical survey data from Project 168, the first time he had seen the official designation in print, had been deemed redundant and of low long-term archival value, and had been subsequently destroyed. The memo was signed by a deputy director he didn't recognize. It was a perfect bureaucratic lie. Files like that were never destroyed. They were the bedrock of all subsequent environmental and engineering work. To destroy them would be an act of gross negligence. They weren't destroyed. They were reclassified, hidden, buried in a deeper vault under a different name. This was his answer. A closed door. A polite, official fabrication intended to end his search. He sat there for a long time, staring at the memo. The system wasn't just passive. It was responsive. He had pushed, and it had pushed back with the quiet, crushing weight of official procedure. He felt a familiar wave of futility wash over him, the same feeling he'd had standing by his brother's graveside, listening to the hollow words about acceptance and moving on. Some things were not meant to be accepted. He returned the box to the assistant and left without seeing Evelyn Thorne again. The walk back to the annex felt longer than usual. The city seemed louder, its ordinary chaos more threatening. When he got back to his desk, there was a message on his screen from his supervisor. Elias, please see me before you leave today. Markham was a man who had been worn smooth by decades of municipal service. He was not unkind, but his first loyalty was to the quiet, orderly functioning of the department. He motioned for Elias to close the door. Had a call from downtown, Markham said, avoiding eye contact. He shuffled some papers on his desk. From the Federal Center. Seems your request yesterday caused a bit of a stir. It was a standard retrieval, Elias said, his voice flat. Was it? Markham finally looked at him. His expression was weary. Look, Elias, I don't know what this personal project of yours is, and I don't want to know. But whatever it is, I'm telling you as your friend, to let it go. There are sensitivities, old history. Some files are classified for a reason. The reason being they were destroyed for redundancy? Elias asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Markham sighed, a deep, rattling sound. Some doors are closed for a reason. Don't go rattling them. You have a good, stable job here. You do it well. Don't jeopardize that over some curiosity about your uncle's old work. Let it lie. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. A piece of advice from a man who knew how the system worked, who understood that its memory was long and its mechanisms for self-preservation were subtle and effective. You didn't get a formal reprimand, your access was curtailed. You didn't get fired, you got passed over for promotion. You didn't get silenced. People just stopped listening to you. That night, sleep offered little escape. He dreamt of water, not a placid reservoir, but a dark, churning river, thick with silt and chemicals he could smell even in the dream. He saw the faces from the photograph, their mouths open but silent, carried along by the current. He saw Ben, standing on the far bank, his expression not of anger or sadness, but of disappointment. He woke up before dawn, the dream clinging to him like the damp chill in the house. He went downstairs to the study. The hole in the wall was still there. He slid the metal box out from under the drop cloth and opened it again. He laid out the contents on the floor. The hurried maps, the columns of data, the photograph of the 7 men. This was all he had. A dead man's unofficial record against the living institution's official lie. Markham's warning echoed in his mind. Let it lie. For a moment he considered it. He could put the box back in the wall, patch the plaster over it, and forget. He could go back to his quiet life, to the hum of the annex and the slow, manageable decay of the house. He could accept the closed doors, the official stories. It would be easier, safer. He picked up one of his uncle's maps. He traced the shaded area along the river with his finger. The Miller farm, the Greaves lot, dozens of families displaced for a public good that was, he now suspected, a cover for a public harm. What had happened to them? The ones who weren't bought off or relocated with a clean record. What had happened to Crow, the geologist who died in an accident? Or Albright, the chemist who was terminated and flagged? And what about his great-uncle Martin, the man who had stayed, who had watched the others leave one by one, who had continued to draw his clean, precise maps for the state, while keeping these other, messier ones hidden in his wall? He hadn't let it lie. He had preserved it. An act of silent, patient defiance. He had passed it on. Elias felt a shift inside him. The fog of grief and futility began to burn away, replaced by something colder and harder. A quiet, focused anger. The system had pushed back. Now he would have to learn to push differently. Not through official channels, but around them. He would have to become like his uncle. Meticulous, patient, and invisible. He began by digitizing everything. Using a high-resolution scanner he brought home from the office under the pretense of archiving old family photos, he captured every page of the file. The maps, the data sheets, the list of names. He photographed the box, the key, the back of the photograph. He saved the files onto a small, encrypted flash drive, a sliver of black plastic that held the entire secret. He spent his evenings in the public library, not his own, using their terminals to dig deeper into the names. He searched old newspaper archives, obituaries, public notices. Most of the men from the photograph were dead. Jansen, the engineer, had died of a heart attack in 1985. Finch, the soil scientist, had moved to Oregon and passed away in 2002. Natural causes, according to the brief obituaries. Only one name, besides his uncle's, yielded something more. Davis, the seventh name on the list, a man he couldn't find in the personnel files. An outsider. An article from a 1963 local paper in Coulter County mentioned a Frank Davis, a community organizer who had raised objections about the land acquisition process, citing health concerns from residents. The article was short, buried on page 12. A follow-up piece was promised but never appeared. Frank Davis vanished from the public record after that. The obstruction was no longer just bureaucratic. It had a human cost. People were not just files to be reclassified. They were lives that had been redirected, silenced, or erased. The pressure was constant now, a low hum in the back of his mind. He started noticing small things. A utility van, the kind used by the phone company, parked on his street for 2 days straight, no one ever getting in or out. His internet connection at home, usually reliable, began to drop at odd hours, especially when he was trying to research. When he called the service provider, they could find no technical fault. At work, the chill from Markham was palpable. He was assigned to a long-term, tedious inventory project in the subbasement, a task reserved for new hires or those being quietly pushed toward retirement. It was a form of isolation, removing him from the main flow of information. His colleagues were polite but distant. Conversations would stop when he approached the break room. He was being subtly quarantined. The loneliness was acute. It mirrored the deep isolation he'd felt after Ben's death, a feeling of being set apart from the normal world, of seeing a truth no one else acknowledged. He started to doubt his own perceptions. Was the van just a van? Was the spotty internet just a failing router? Was the professional distance of his colleagues just a reaction to his own withdrawn, obsessive behavior? He sat in the subbasement of the annex, surrounded by shelves of decaying ledgers bound in canvas and leather, the air thick with the sweet, cloying smell of old paper. His task was to inventory them, a job that would take months. It was a make-work project, a bureaucratic exile. He ran his hand over the rough cover of a ledger from 1890. The solid, physical reality of it was comforting. This was real. The van, the silence, the feeling of being watched, that was all ephemeral, deniable. Maybe Markham was right. Maybe he was chasing ghosts. The thought of his brother surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Ben had been the opposite of Elias. Open, trusting, quick to laugh. He saw the world as a straightforward place. It was Elias who had always looked for the hidden clause, the footnote, the discrepancy in the record. After the accident, Elias had replayed it endlessly in his mind. The police report was simple. Too simple. Ben was a careful driver. He knew that road. Elias had walked the crash site himself a week later. He'd found nothing, of course. Just broken glass and the raw, splintered trunk of a pine tree. But the absence of an explanation had felt like a presence, a void that his grief couldn't fill. Now he was doing it again. He was taking a collection of old papers from a dead man's wall and building a conspiracy around it. He was projecting his own unresolved sorrow onto a bureaucratic anomaly. The men in the photograph were old. They had lived their lives. The project was over. The dam was built. The world had moved on. What good could come from digging it all up? All he was accomplishing was the slow, methodical destruction of his own quiet life. He almost gave in. That night, he took the flash drive from his desk drawer. He held it in his palm, the little piece of plastic that was causing all the trouble. He could smash it with a hammer, burn the original files, and patch the hole in the wall. He could apologize to Markham, dedicate himself to the Ledger project, and slowly, surely, earn his way back into the quiet, ordered world he had forfeited. He could let the ghosts rest. But as he stood there, the image of his great-uncle's face from the photograph returned to him. The unreadable expression. Not a man at peace. A man holding something back. Martin had lived in this house for another 30 years after the project ended. He had walked these same floors, looked out these same windows. He had lived with the knowledge of what was in that box, of what it represented. He hadn't destroyed it. He had preserved it. It wasn't an act of obsession. It was an act of faith. A belief that someday someone would open the box and understand. It was a responsibility passed down in silence. Elias slid the flash drive back into his pocket. His doubt hadn't vanished, but it had receded, replaced by a grim clarity. His sanity didn't depend on dismissing the threat. It depended on facing it. He was not his brother. He did not see the world as a simple place. His nature, the one that had made him a good archivist and a solitary man, was the one thing he could trust. He noticed patterns. He saw discrepancies. And this was the largest discrepancy of his life. He was not chasing his grief. He was honoring his uncle's legacy. The quiet resistance of one thorn had now become the quiet resistance of another. He had to find a way to make the system acknowledge its own history, and he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed an insider. He needed Evelyn Thorne. He didn't try to schedule a meeting. He didn't file another request. He waited. For 2 weeks, he performed his duties in the sub-basement with meticulous care, creating no ripples. He left work at 5 o'clock on the dot each day. He became predictable, boring, a man who had accepted his exile. Then, on a Tuesday, he waited for her outside the Federal Center, standing across the street as the evening rush of government workers thinned to a trickle. She emerged just after 6, walking with the same erect, controlled posture she maintained behind her desk. She carried a worn leather briefcase. She did not seem surprised to see him standing there, waiting by the crosswalk. She didn't slow down or speed up. She simply acknowledged his presence with a slight, almost imperceptible nod as she drew level with him. "Walk with me, Elias," she said, her voice barely audible above the traffic. It wasn't a question. They walked in silence for 3 blocks, away from the grand federal buildings and into the quieter, older part of the city. The evening light was muted, the sky a hazy, indistinct gray. The sounds of the city softened, replaced by the soft scuff of their shoes on the pavement. She led him to a small, anonymous park, little more than a patch of grass with a few concrete benches. She chose a bench that faced away from the street, under the dense canopy of an old oak tree. She sat, placing her briefcase beside her. Elias remained standing. "You've been loud," she said, looking straight ahead at the darkening lawn. "Going through official channels. Talking to Markham. You've been ringing the dinner bell." "I was given a lie," Elias replied. "The files weren't destroyed." "No," she agreed. "Of course not. Destruction is messy. Reclassification is clean. They're in a sublevel vault. Not even I have access without a director's countersignature. And the director will never sign." "Why?" She turned her head slightly, her gaze finally meeting his. In the low light, her face seemed less severe, etched with a deep weariness he hadn't seen before. "Because the project never really ended. The dam was built, the reservoir was filled, but the consequences, they don't follow a timeline. They just spread. Like the chemicals." There it was. The confirmation. The thing he knew from the box in the wall, now spoken aloud. "What chemicals?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Industrial solvents. Byproducts from a manufacturing process. The government wanted a certain material for a defense contract. Very high priority. The company that made it had a plant upstream from the valley. They were careless. The state found out. The company was too important to punish, the contract too vital to interrupt. So they buried it. Literally. They declared the area a public works project, bought out the land, flooded the valley, and sealed the records. The story was simple, brutal, and utterly plausible. A quiet, efficient solution. The men in the photograph, Elias said, reaching into his coat and pulling out the worn print. He held it out to her. She took it, her long fingers brushing his. She stared at it for a long time. "The Oversight Committee," she murmured. "The ones who were supposed to make sure it was done properly. The good soldiers." She tapped a finger on the face of the geologist. Crow. He figured out the plume was spreading, that it wouldn't be contained by the bedrock. He was going to go public. He had an accident at a quarry site before he could. She moved her finger to the chemist. "Albright." He confirmed Crow's data. They couldn't arrange another accident so soon. They just fired him, discredited him. He drank himself to death a few years later. Her voice was a monotone, a recitation of facts stripped of all emotion. But the precision was its own form of feeling. A confession delivered as a report. "And Martin Thorne?" Elias asked. "My great-uncle?" She handed the photograph back to him. Martin was the mapmaker. He knew where everything was. The test wells, the dump sites, the contaminated soil. He charted it all. When the others were pushed out, he stayed. I think he felt it was his duty to keep a true map of what they had done. He was a quiet man. He thought he could be a silent witness. But the silence eats at you. Cost him everything. His friendships. His peace of mind. She paused. It cost him his family. The words landed with a dead weight. "What do you mean?" Evelyn looked away, back toward the empty lawn. "Your father knew." Martin told him some of it years later. "Your father was a journalist, wasn't he? Before he took that teaching job. He started asking questions. Not like you. He was loud. He tried to find Frank Davis, the organizer. He made calls. He filed information requests." She stopped, her throat working. "That was a few months before your brother's accident." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The hum in Elias's ears roared to life. "Ben." The black ice. The simple, closed explanation. It wasn't about Ben at all. It was a message for his father. A warning shot that had hit the wrong target. And it had worked. His father had crumbled. He had never spoken of it, had never asked another question. He had simply retreated into a shell of grief, leaving Elias with a loss he could never understand. "They killed my brother to silence my father?" The question was a whisper. "They don't think of it that way," Evelyn said, her voice devoid of comfort. "They don't kill people. They mitigate threats, they resolve situations. A car that's known to have faulty brakes. A patch of road that is predictably hazardous. They just create the conditions for an accident to happen. It's clean. Deniable. The system protects itself. It has no malice. It just has imperatives." She finally stood up, her brief moment of confession over. She was the gatekeeper again. "Martin tried. I tried to help him in small ways. Losing records, delaying requests. It wasn't enough. I've spent the last 30 years managing a library of poison. Now you have a page from that library. What you do with it is your decision. But know this, you cannot win a direct fight. The system is patient. It doesn't need to defeat you. It just needs to outlast you." She turned to leave. "Why are you telling me this?" Elias asked, his voice raw. "Why help me now?" She paused, her back to him. "Because Martin was my cousin," she said quietly. "And because you have his eyes. You have the same stubborn refusal to look away. Don't make the same mistakes he did. Don't make the mistakes your father did. Don't be loud. Be smart." She walked away without looking back, her figure dissolving into the twilight. Elias stood by the bench, the cold photograph in his hand. The truth was not a key that unlocked a door. It was a weight, and now it was his to carry. The grief for his brother was no longer a vague, shapeless sorrow. It had a name. It had a reason. And the system that was responsible for it was still in place, humming quietly in its concrete building, waiting for him to make his next move. He walked home through the sleeping city. The weight in his pocket, the flash drive, felt heavier than ever. Evelyn's words echoed in his mind. "Don't be loud. Be smart." The path of direct confrontation had led to his brother's death and his father's collapse. A grand gesture, leaking the whole story to a major newspaper, would be loud. It would create a firestorm of headlines, official denials, and inquiries that would ultimately be steered into a dead end by the very system they were meant to expose. The system thrived on managing crises. It would absorb the blow, redact the evidence, and wait for the news cycle to move on. He would be discredited, a grieving sun spinning conspiracies, and the truth would be buried again, this time under a fresh layer of official dismissal. He couldn't win by attacking the center. He had to chip away at the edges. He spent the next month in a state of intense, clandestine activity. By day, he was the model employee in the sub-basement, diligently cataloging ledgers, his work perfect and his demeanor subdued. He was invisible, forgotten. By night, his small house became a command center. He didn't just have his uncle's data anymore. He had Evelyn's context. He had the why. Now he needed to connect it to the who. Using the library's computers, he began a different kind of search. He wasn't looking for the perpetrators. They were insulated, protected by layers of time and bureaucracy. He was looking for the victims. He focused on Coulter County, in the years after the dam was built. He cross-referenced public health statistics, searching for anomalies. It was slow, painstaking work. He looked for cancer clusters, birth defects, spikes in rare neurological disorders. He found them, small, statistically insignificant on their own, but when mapped onto his uncle's drawings of the contaminated zones, a clear and terrifying pattern emerged. The illnesses followed the path of the water. He compiled the information into a new set of files on the flash drive. He created a dispassionate, factual narrative, linking the declassified land acquisition records to the public health data. He used only publicly available information, things that could be independently verified. His uncle's hidden documents were the key, the secret index that showed how to connect the public dots. The result was not an accusation. It was an undeniable, data-driven inference. It was a map of consequences. Now he had to decide where to send it. Not to one place, but to many. A single point of attack was a single point of failure. He needed to create multiple, independent threads of inquiry that the system couldn't easily contain all at once. He identified 3 targets. First, the Environmental Law Clinic at the State University. They were underfunded and overworked, but they were tenacious and operated outside the political machinery. Second, a small, independent newspaper in Coulter County itself. It had a circulation of less than 5,000, but it was trusted by the local community, the very people who had been living with the consequences for 50 years. Third, a newly elected state representative from a neighboring district, a young idealist who had run on a platform of government transparency and was a junior member of the Environmental Oversight Committee. She was too new to be cynical, too low-level to be a target herself. He created 3 separate packages. Each contained a copy of the flash drive and a brief, anonymous cover letter explaining the contents in dry, technical terms. He made no mention of his family, his uncle, or the cabal of men who orchestrated the cover-up. He presented it only as a matter of public record and public health. The data had to speak for itself. The act of sending them was the final, irreversible step. He drove to 3 different towns on a Saturday, mailing each package from a different post office, paying for the postage in cash. As the last padded envelope slid into the blue collection box, he felt not a sense of triumph, but of profound release. The weight was no longer his alone. He had taken his uncle's preserved secret and turned it into a living question. He had planted seeds in stony ground. He had no idea if they would grow. He had to be content with the act itself. The days that followed were a study in quiet tension. The world continued as if nothing had happened. The hum at the annex was unchanged. Markham gave him a brief, approving nod one morning, a sign that his period of exile was perhaps nearing its end. The utility van did not reappear on his street. The silence was absolute. He resisted the urge to check for results. He didn't search the university's website, or the newspapers, or the legislators. To look for a response was to betray his anonymity, to show his hand. He had to trust that the seeds were viable, that the system's own inertia would prevent it from noticing these small, scattered inquiries until it was too late. His part was over. He had delivered the message. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The silence stretched, becoming its own kind of answer. He began to think he had failed. The packages had been intercepted or ignored, dismissed as the work of a crank. The system had won through its sheer monolithic indifference. The thought brought not anger, but a deep, hollow exhaustion. He had shot his one arrow into the dark, and it had vanished without a sound. Then, one evening, while scrolling through the state news aggregator for a work-related item, he saw it. A small headline at the bottom of the page. University Clinic announces Coulter water study. The article was brief. It stated that the State University Environmental Law Clinic was partnering with the Coulter County Chronicle to launch a preliminary investigation into historical water quality issues in the North Ridge Reservoir area. Citing newly analyzed historical data, there was a quote from the young state representative, praising the initiative as a vital step toward ensuring public trust and transparency. It was a beginning, a tiny, almost invisible crack in the concrete facade of the official story. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't justice. It was just a question being asked in a place where questions had been forbidden for half a century. The system hadn't been defeated, but it had been forced to acknowledge a discrepancy. The official record was now contested. A few days later, a plain white envelope arrived at the annex, addressed to him. There was no return address. It had been routed through the interdepartmental mail. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printout of his original denied records request from the Federal Center. Scrawled at the bottom, in a familiar, sharp handwriting, were 2 words. Well done. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. It was the only acknowledgement he would ever receive, and it was enough. Elias stood in the study of his great-uncle's house. The hole in the wall was now patched, the fresh plaster smooth and white under his hand. He had sanded it flush, primed it, and painted it to match the rest of the room. The scar was gone. The house was quiet. For the first time since he had moved in, it didn't feel like a tomb or a monument to decay. Felt like just a house. He had finished the last of the major repairs the week before. The leaky roof was sound, the furnace reliable, the wiring updated. He had wrestled the house back from its slow decline. The work had been a form of grieving, a way to occupy his hands while his mind processed a loss he couldn't name. Then it had become a form of investigation, the house itself providing the first clue. Now it was just work that was finished. The house was no longer his. He had listed it with a realtor that morning. The proceeds from the sale would be enough to move somewhere else, somewhere smaller, somewhere with no history. He walked through the empty rooms, his footsteps echoing slightly. He paused at the window that looked out onto the quiet street. He had done what he could. He had honored his uncle's quiet act of resistance. He had found a name for the grief that had shadowed his family for a generation. There would be no public reckoning, no neat conclusion. The wheels of the university study and the legislative inquiry would turn slowly, if at all. The system would adapt, obscure, and defend. But a story that had been buried was now in the light, however faint. It was out of his hands. He was leaving this place, this history, behind. He was not forgetting it, but he was refusing to be defined by it. He picked up his coat and walked out the front door, leaving the key on the kitchen counter. He didn't lock the door behind him. Months later, he was living in a small apartment in a city 300 miles away. It was an anonymous place, a unit in a large brick building with dozens of identical doors. He had a new job working for a private cartography firm, a job that was technical and precise with no access to sensitive histories. His life was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of peace, not of suppression. One afternoon, an envelope appeared in his mailbox. It was a standard business-size envelope, made of cheap paper with no return address. His own address was typed, the letters slightly uneven, as if done on an old machine. He took it upstairs and opened it with a letter opener. Inside was no letter, just an old photograph, a black and white snapshot, faded and creased at the corners. It showed a small child, a girl of about 5 or 6, playing with a pail and shovel on the muddy bank of a wide, slow-moving river. On the back, Written in the faint, spidery pencil script of an elderly person were 3 words. This was me, and below that, a single, shaky line. Thank you. Elias stared at the photograph for a long time. He didn't know the name of the child, or the name of the person who had sent it. He never would. It was an echo from a life he hadn't known, from a place he had only ever seen on a map. He placed the photo on the windowsill where it caught the afternoon light. The fight was not over. For people like the child by the river, it was only just beginning. But his part was done. A quiet action had produced a quiet reply, a single human connection across a void of 50 years. The hum of the old systems was distant now, almost inaudible. But he knew he would never stop listening for it.